Dave Smith here. Okay, so as I've said in previous videos, I have been through a process of yet again re-evaluating my cameras and camera systems. Quite some time ago now, 2 or 3 years ago, I had made the decision, having retired, how I was going to spend the time was to travel and take photographs. Of course, COVID-19 has severely put paid to plans like that. I'm not sure when I'll ever get to travel globally again. I will travel in the UK, and my plans at the moment are to make my photographs in the UK. And the kinds of photographs I'm changing as well, which is one reason why I have decided to do the master's degree. But I had changed my camera system. I did have a big investment in Nikon cameras, a D810, a D500 and a whole slew of big fast lenses. The whole kit weighed an absolute ton. And you know what they say, any view more than 25 yards from the car isn't worth photographing. Well, it was more than true with that kit, let me tell you. So a long time ago I got rid of that, and for travelling I decided that I was going to pare down the number of lenses dramatically and focus particularly on sort of architecture, street and landscapes. So I was looking for a small compact system, and I ended up with the Fuji X-T3. As you know, the Fuji systems are all aps-c. So then, now that I've come back and travel isn't what I'm going to do, I've re-evaluated whether that's the system that I want to use. Now, in fact, I'm heading back to film. Fairly disenchanted with digital photography altogether, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. But there are some things that I do want digital for. So let's talk a bit about where I'm heading. So I am looking into getting back to film. I have this beautiful Horseman 5x4 LX, and I'm intending to buy a 6x12 system. I was thinking about the Photoman D-Max, but there's another camera come on the horizon that I may prefer. But we'll get into that once I get down that road a little bit. Right now I'm going to talk about digital. So there are plenty of people who will tell you that you don't need full frame. aps-c is absolutely fine. And I think there's some truth in that, by and large, but not universally. I think if you, are interested in depth of field effects, these days marketing men have termed the term bokeh, and marketing, really. Don't get me started. But if you're interested in depth of field, it is true to say that you can get the same depth of field with an aps-c camera as you can with a full frame, but it does come with some costs, and in particular you need fast lenses, because don't forget that when you multiply the focal length by the crop factor, so your 50mm lens becomes a 75mm lens, so does your depth of field change. So if you have a 50mm f1.4 on your full frame or your film camera, and you want the same depth of field, then you need to divide by the crop factor, which is the same as multiplying by 1/, so 2/3 in the case of Nikon. So you would need a lens that was 2.803, so about 0.9 to f1, to give you the same depth of field as an f1.8 lens. I hope I've said all that correct. No, I said 1.4, didn't I? Mine is an f1.8, so you would need an f1.2 lens in aps-c cameras. If you had an f1.4 lens, then you'd need an f1, and those are pretty expensive, and I don't really want to put that much money into a camera system. I really want to be able to use the legacy lenses that are available, because A, there's so many of them, B, they're so good, and C, they're very cheap, as opposed to buying the latest and greatest from Fujifilm, for example. So that's one consideration, is those fast lenses. Now, I wanted fast lenses not just for the depth of field effects, which I quite like, but also because in terms of where I'm going with the masters, one of the projects I want to work on is astrophotography, and my reasons for that I'll leave to a video closer to the time of starting that project. But I do want to do that, and so fast lenses do make sense. Now, one of the issues that you've got with aps-c is the difficulty of finding wide-angle lenses, and in particular fast wide-angle lenses. There are relatively few. They tend to be zooms, and they tend to be slow, typically around f4. And then don't forget, if you're changing from that to aps-c, so an f4 lens on an aps-c is actually equivalent to an f6 for depth of field, not for light gathering, but an f4 for astrophotography is still pretty slow, I would say. So all of that taken into consideration, that suggested to me that I wanted full frame. So I started looking into full frame. Now, I think the problem we have these days is that marketing departments have got hold of all this, and my goodness, they're very, very good at their job. So, for example, you might have a range of features that you're interested in having in your camera, but the whole range doesn't come in this camera or that camera until you get to the very highest spec cameras. So they're driving you upwards in the expense. So I felt that it was necessary for me. Remember, I don't want to invest entirely in digital. I want to use digital for some things, but ideally I want to work in film. So they're driving you up to that upper end. So I felt what I needed to do was to focus as closely as I can, no pun intended, on precisely what my needs were going to be from this system. So what is that going to be? Well, this is all in part in preparation for the masters, and also in response to the way that my interests in photography have changed in recent years. And I've talked before about this, but I will just mention again that those interests are really now about series of photographs, about telling stories, about putting together zines and booklets. And that's a different approach to the sort of grand landscapes that I have been working on in the past. Okay, so I want to work in film, and so my first consideration was how am I going to get that in a digital form? Because if I think further down that line, I don't want to just take these pictures and then leave them sitting in a folder somewhere or on a hard drive. What I want to do ultimately is to make my booklets, and either as digitally printed zines or, more interestingly, as photogravure handmade books of photogravure prints. So that kind of leads me along a certain path, and that path is to do with digital negatives. In the case of gravure, they'd be positives, of course, but we will stick with the vernacular. So how will I make those? Well, I'm not going at this stage to buy a digital printer, an inkjet printer, because I think they are frankly a nightmare. So I'm going to make my positives with a print bureau to make image setter negatives, and all of that will come back to in future videos. But I need to digitize these things, and you could buy a flatbed scanner, Epson V something or other, 600, 700, something like that. The trouble with those is they take forever and a day. Scanning is incredibly slow. So recently I've looked into digitizing your film negatives using a DSLR and a macro lens. So I've decided that's the route I'm going to go. I like to shoot macro in any case, and a future project may well involve macro, to do with scale and size and space and all those kinds of approaches. So macro is one of the sort of considerations. So then I'm thinking my current project, the one I've got in mind for the Masters, and I'm hoping, following on from that, PhD, is to do with exploring time. And in that I'm going to continue to make my time lapses and hyperlapses. So that was a consideration. So then I'm thinking, well, maybe I'd like to make those in 8K. And then you need a big megapixel camera. So that was leading me to the D850 or the D810. And I then also considered the Canon 5DSR. The 5DSR in the end seemed to be a bit too long in the tooth. And 50 megapixels, who really needs that? So in the end I moved away from the Canon and settled on Nikon. The D850 is too much expense for where I'm intending to use digital, just to be able to shoot 8K time-lapse. I decided that 6K would be perfectly adequate. And so that led me to a 24 megapixel sensor. Now, 24 megapixels is more than enough for the vast majority of people, whoever they are, whatever you're shooting. This constant drive towards sharper and sharper images, more and more detail, is truly just about marketing. I'm not just talking here about the marketing departments of Canon and Nikon and Sony and Fuji and all the rest of them. It's the whole infrastructure around them, the pundits on YouTube, the photography magazines, the constant sort of comparing this lens to that lens, or this sensor to that sensor, or the amount of detail that you can squeeze out with this lens on that sensor. There's a vast industry about it, and it's totally unnecessary. If you have a 24 megapixel camera, that's 6,000 pixels on the long side. Even at 300 dots per inch on your print, that's a 20-inch print. A 20-inch print is pretty big. When you've put that in a, let's say, what would you want, a 3-inch mount? That's a 26-inch wide print, plus a frame on top of that. That's quite a sizable print on your wall. The print behind me is not at 20 inches. So it is more than enough. And also, there's an old sort of printer's saying that 300 dots per inch at 1 foot, 1 dot per inch at 300 feet. So that means if you're looking at a magazine and you hold a magazine about 12 inches away, because that's around the diagonal of a 10 by 8, and that's what we think of as the sort of definition for things like circle of confusion for depth of field. So about 12 inches away, then you want 300 dots per inch. But if your print is on the wall, unless you're going to go and put your nose up against it, you're not looking at that at 12 inches. And if you've got a 20-inch print, you're definitely not looking at that at 12 inches. So more like 200 dots would do, in which case your 6,000 pixel sensor will give you a 30-inch print. That is huge. Huge. So 99.9% of people don't need them, and I certainly don't need any more than that. I'm intending to print photogravures and possibly as big as A4 booklets and zines, and that's it. Now, in the old days of film, if you were shooting on 35mm film, you would not make a 4-foot gallery print from 35mm film. If that's what your métier was, you would probably shoot 5x4, 5x7, or 10x8 to make those gallery size prints. Now, how many of us are shooting gallery size prints? And even if you are, I see now that Fujifilm and Hasselblad are making 400 megapixel cameras. Now, they're not 400 megapixel sensors, they're 100 megapixel sensors that they use some shift technology. Just ridiculous, truly ridiculous. No need for it at all. I've rambled a bit there, I'm sorry. But I'm also going to point out that things like, and I'm paraphrasing, blazing fast autofocus. The times when you need super fast autofocus are few and far between. Possibly the standard of bird and sport photography, but not really even then. You think back to the pre-digital days, there were plenty of photographers taking bird photography with manual focus, 600mm, unstabilised lenses on unstabilised film camera bodies. Now, okay, all this fancy stuff makes it easier, but it's getting to the point where the cameras are taking the pictures. All you're doing as a photographer is pointing it in the right direction and holding it steady as you can. That's not photography. And this whole thing about sharpness, the sharpness in digital. Since when does that become the arbiter of a quality photograph? A quality image is not about how sharp it is corner to corner. And digital these days is starting to look like, well, actually digital always has looked like somebody's cut the subject out with a scalpel and stuck it on a background. Excuse me. Yeah, not very impressive at all. So, the upshot of all that rambling is that my feeling is that I don't need blazing fast autofocus. I don't need massive numbers of pixels. I don't need 14 frames per second shooting. I shoot mountains, they're not going anywhere. And so, all those features in these high-end bodies, unnecessary. And so why pay the money for them? Much better to put the money into lenses. And in general, that's true. The sensors these days, literally any sensor from any manufacturer is going to do a great job. And don't be listening to all that stuff about, I like the colour out of this manufacturer better than that manufacturer. Shoot in RAW and choose the colour for yourself. There's lots of great things you can do with colour if you're shooting in RAW. And maybe if there's interest, I'll get into that in more detail in the future. So, where did all of that lead me? Well, I had decided that I wanted full frame. I decided that not mirrorless. The mirrorless I'm not comfortable with the mirrorless. To me, they're too small in the hand, and I don't have big hands. I just think they're too small. It goes to that idea that if some is good, more must be better. Well, not necessarily. Just because we can shrink everything down and reduce the size and make it miniature doesn't mean that everything has to be as small as we can possibly get it. And actually, I think that the DSLR, the film camera, form factor is about perfect. I've shown you this camera before. This is the Nikon F5. I bought this particularly because I wanted to use the Silver Sols film, which I've also mentioned before. This is a big, heavy camera, but it fits nicely in your hand. It's nicely balanced, and I really like it. So, I did not want it mirrorless. mirrorless. I've tried mirrorless twice before. I had the Sony A6000 and I've recently had the Fuji X-T. And they're great cameras. Any of these cameras, literally any of these cameras, will do a perfectly good job. I just feel for me they're too small in the hand. So that then left me with Nikon and Canon and Pentax. I discounted Pentax just because I don't know the system very well and never used it, and I'm unclear about the lenses that are available for it. The Canon went for much the same reason. I don't doubt for an instant that the sensors on Canons are brilliant. I don't doubt for a moment that the lenses are spectacular. But I've always, for over 30 years, I've shot with Nikon, so I know the system really well. So I decided pretty quickly that that's the system I was going to land on. So if I've discounted the big megapixels and the super expensive up to the minute bodies with all their sort of autofocus speeds and 500 autofocus points and 15 frames per second or whatever they are, I don't know what they are, then that removed the 800 series, it removed the D780. It's too new, too expensive. So I landed on the D750, but then I got a problem of finding one, because the thing is that the D750s found their niche in the sort of professional service photographer, the wedding and portrait photographers, and my goodness, those cameras got a beating. So very often the used market has them with the best I found was 20,000 actuations, which I'll grant you isn't very many, but they were again quite expensive, heading sort of 800, 900 pounds, which I felt was too much. To get a more reasonable price body, then you're in the 100,000 actuations, or certainly getting towards that. And if you've got 75,000 actuations, that's half the lifetime. Now, you may well think, well, are you really going to shoot 75,000 actuations to take it to its shutter maximum, shutter life? Well, no, I'm definitely not. I've had this camera, the A6000, for many years now, since it came out actually, and that's only done about 20,000 actuations. I'll say more about that in a moment. So no, I wouldn't, but just because the shutters are rated for 150,000 doesn't mean it'll get there. That's an average, remember. So at 75,000, you can imagine it's potentially getting towards the end of its life, and that's an expensive repair. So when I'm looking for a second-hand camera, I'm looking for one that's in pretty good shape and has a relatively low shutter count, and I'm happy to pay some sort of premium for that, just not the sort of £900 that these 750s were going for. And then I thought, well, hang on, why not a 610? Now, the D610 got a bad press because the D600 was plagued by some problems on its release. But the D610 does have a 24 megapixel sensor. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that the latest cameras have. It doesn't have sort of massive numbers of autofocus points, but I don't care about that. I don't care how long it takes to autofocus. As I say, I'm typically shooting pretty static subjects, and quite often I'm manually focusing anyway. So that doesn't bother me. The frame rate doesn't bother me. 4K doesn't bother me. The only videos I really make are these videos, and I can shoot 6K time-lapse. So I was perfectly happy with that, and here is my D610. It's in stunning condition. It's used. It's got 800 actuations, so used but only just. And I'm pretty happy with it so far. I haven't shot with it yet. I don't expect it to be any different from the D800 and the D810 that I've had in the past. But I'm pretty pleased with that as a camera. It's got dual card slots. I don't really care about that. Does not have a tilty screen. I do care about that. I would really have liked a tilt screen, but it is just one more thing to go wrong, and you're paying a premium. So those were my considerations. That's where I was coming from and what I was looking for in a digital camera. In the past, I would just have, but I was shooting in digital, and in the past I would just have bought the D850 and got on with it. But because I actually wanted to move back to film, I wanted to be a bit more circumspect about exactly what I was buying in terms of digital equipment. So those were my considerations. What about yours? What system are you shooting with? Are you shooting film? If you are shooting digital, or you're thinking about changing digital, or you're just getting into digital, I would really like to know what your considerations are and what you go for in the end. Let me just mention this little thing. I do love this camera. This is the Sony A6000. But you can see what I mean by a bit small in the hand. If that wasn't in this cradle, that is a tiny, tiny camera. I have this because this is my full spectrum converted camera, and I have kept it. I toyed with the idea of selling it, but I have kept it because I'm intending to shoot some astrophotography as part of the wider MFA project. More on that in the future. Anyway, I've rambled a bit in this video. I hope it's been of some interest. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.